Chapter 1. Coin and Mud. Rain came down in thin, needling sheets that turned the Drakwald road into a black ribbon of sucking filth. Wheels ground through it with a low, tortured groan. The forest loomed on either side, ancient and indifferent, its branches knitted so thick overhead that even at midday the light was the color of bruised flesh. Hauptmann Lucas Krieger rode at the fore, hunched beneath a dark oilskin cloak, gone stiff with old blood and rain. His beard was iron-grey, cropped short for convenience rather than vanity, and a jagged scar split one eyebrow where a Tillian crossbow bolt had once tried to take his eye. The eye remained. The boltman did not. He kept one gauntleted hand resting near the pommel of his sword as if the weapon were a faithful dog. His other hand held the reins loosely. His horse, a rangy Reichland gelding with ribs beginning to show, snorted uneasily and rolled its eyes at every snapping branch. Behind him creaked the convoy. 2 armored wagons, iron-banded and reinforced, trudged through the mire like wounded beasts. Their canvas covers sagged with rainwater. Inside lay sacks of barley, sealed chests of silver crowns, and bundles of parchment detailing livestock tallies and grain quotas in meticulous ink, the Emperor's share. The lifeblood wrung from villages, already running dry. Halberdiers marched alongside, boots vanishing ankle-deep in muck with every step. Their uniforms were mismatched from years of attrition, breastplates dented, sleeves patched, helmets of 3 different patterns. Each man wore the red and white of Reichland, though the colours had long since dulled to the shade of old scabs. Crossbowmen walked near the wagons, weapons unstrung but ready. Their eyes flicked constantly to the tree line. The Drakwald did not need to move to feel alive. It breathed. It watched. At the center of the procession rode a smaller mule cart beneath an oiled awning. Seated upon it, hunched like a carrion bird over ledgers, was Brother Adalbert of the Sigmarite Temple. His tonsure shone with rain. His fingers were ink-stained to the nail-beds. He muttered figures beneath his breath as though reciting prayers. 3 sacks short in Ebersdorf, he hissed, scratching with a quill. 2 oxen unaccounted for in Heiligen, a deficit of 19 crowns in Almsbridge. He looked up only once, squinting at the sodden countryside as if the landscape itself were committing fraud. Trailing the convoy were a handful of peasants from the last village, visited gaunt figures wrapped in rag and sackcloth. They had begged to follow, claiming their hamlet had nothing left. If they remained, they would starve. If they fled to Altdorf, perhaps they would starve more slowly. Krieger had allowed them to march behind. He told himself it was practical. More eyes, more bodies to haul wheels free if needed. The truth was less comfortable. By mid-morning they reached the village of Durn Hollow, a scatter of leaning timber houses crouched around a well choked with moss. Smoke rose thinly from only 2 chimneys. Children with distended bellies watched from doorways. The village elder, a woman bent like a snapped spear shaft, approached with 2 men carrying a small sack between them. "That is all," she rasped. Adalbert dismounted immediately, boots sinking into the mud with a wet squelch. He opened the sack. Inside lay perhaps a quarter of what the tithe ledger demanded. "This is insufficient," he said without looking up. "The Emperor's levy does not diminish because of weather." "Blight took the wheat," one of the men said, voice cracking. "Black rot. We burned half the fields. Then something came from the trees and took the sheep, tore them apart. Not wolves." A murmur rippled through the gathered villagers. "Beastmen," someone whispered. Krieger's gaze drifted to the forest edge. The trees stood silent, wet bark gleaming like slick muscle. "Tracks," he asked. The man nodded. "Cloven. Big as dinner plates." Adalbert sniffed. "Rumors and superstition do not alter the Emperor's accounts. You are short by 40 crowns in value. There is no more," the elder said. Silence stretched. Rain pattered against wood and iron. Krieger swung down from his saddle. He crouched, scooped a handful of soil from beside the road, and rubbed it between his fingers. Rot, too wet, too cold. He had seen fields like this before, campaigns, land that fed no one. He stood. "Take what they have," he said quietly to Adalbert. "Mark the deficit. We'll report blight and livestock loss." Adalbert's thin lips tightened. "And if the Grand Theogonist asks why Reichland's tithe falters, then he may come count sheep himself." Adalbert glared but nodded curtly. The sack was taken. The villagers watched as though witnessing the removal of a limb. By afternoon, the rain thickened to a steady downpour. The road narrowed as the trees pressed closer. The air smelled of damp leaves and something older like wet fur, left too long in a cellar. They had nearly reached the old stone waymarker when riders emerged from the tree line ahead. 6 of them, mounted, armored in mismatched mail and leather. At their head rode a man in a dark green cloak clasped with a silver brooch bearing the stag crest of Baron Ottmar von Reissen. Krieger's jaw tightened. The Reeve reined in, offering a smile that did not reach his eyes. He was clean-shaven, hair slicked back, gloves of fine leather untouched by mud. "Hauptmann Krieger," the Reeve called over the rain. "His lordship sends his regards." "I doubt that," Krieger replied. The Reeve's smile thinned. "The Drakwald grows unsettled. My lord has stationed patrols to ensure safe passage. Such services require support." Adalbert perked up like a dog scenting coin. "This tithe is bound for Altdorf. It is not subject to local levy. Customary forest tax," the Reeve corrected smoothly. "A modest share. 10% will suffice." 10, Adalbert sputtered. Krieger stepped forward, hand resting on his sword pommel. "The Emperor's share moves first." The Reeve leaned slightly in his saddle. "Accidents happen on lonely roads, Hauptmann. Wheels break, horses vanish, men lose their way in the fog." The halberdiers shifted uneasily. Krieger stared at the man. He imagined pulling him down into the mud and forcing his face into it until the rain filled his lungs. "Tell your Baron," Krieger said, voice flat, "that the Drakwald answers to steel, not parchment. We will require no escort." The Reeve held his gaze for a long moment. Then he smiled again, colder now. "As you wish." They rode back into the trees without another word. The forest seemed to swallow them whole. Dusk came early beneath the Drakwald canopy. The rain slackened to a mist that clung like cobwebs. Shadows pooled between the trees. Krieger raised a fist. The convoy halted. "Camp tight," he ordered. "Circle the wagons." Men moved quickly, boots slapping in mud. Crossbows were strung. A small fire was coaxed to life beneath a canvas lean-to, smoke hugging the ground. The peasants huddled near the wagons, whispering. It began with a shout. One of the crossbowmen staggered backward from the tree line, a shaft buried deep in his throat. Blood pumped around the wood in thick, dark surges. He clawed at it uselessly, eyes bulging, then fell face first into the mud. "Contact!" someone roared. Figures burst from the trees, ragged men in torn cloaks and piecemeal armor. Not beastmen, not horned or furred. Human. Starving, they came screaming. The first slammed into a halberdier, knocking him flat. The two rolled in the mud, grappling like animals. A rusted knife flashed. It punched into the halberdier's armpit where the armor gaped. The blade went into the hilt. The halberdier convulsed, choking as blood flooded his mouth. Krieger was already moving. He drew his sword in a single fluid motion and met the nearest attacker head-on. The man swung a woodcutter's axe wildly. Krieger stepped inside the arc and drove his blade upward beneath the ribs. He felt resistance cartilage, muscle, then the sudden give as steel slid home. The bandit's scream became a wet gurgle. Krieger wrenched the blade free. Steam rose from the open belly. Mud exploded under boots and bodies. A crossbow twanged. A bolt punched through a bandit's cheek, tearing out teeth in a spray of red and white fragments. The man spun, shrieking, and fell beneath trampling feet. A halberd rose and fell, chopping into a shoulder. Bone cracked audibly. The blade stuck. The wielder tried to yank it free, but a second attacker leapt onto his back, teeth bared, dagger sawing at his throat. Blood sheeted down both of them, hot and bright, against the cold rain. Krieger pivoted, parried a thrust, and smashed the pommel of his sword into a gaunt face. Cartilage crunched. He brought the blade down in a diagonal cut that split collarbone and bit deep into lung. The man dropped without a sound. Someone grabbed Krieger from behind. Fingers hooked into his gorget. He drove his head backward, felt his skull connect with a nose. Something broke. He twisted and slashed low. The sword took the attacker's thigh nearly through. The man fell, screaming, clutching the ruin of his leg as blood pumped in arterial bursts, each one weaker than the last. The fight dissolved into pockets of brutal intimacy. No formations, no honor, just men hacking at each other in sucking mud, slipping, falling, rising again slick with gore. It lasted perhaps 2 minutes. When it ended, the forest swallowed the echoes. 5 of the attackers lay dead. 2 of Krieger's men lay still. One gurgled weakly, trying to hold his intestines inside his belly as though they were spilled grain. A final bandit had been pinned beneath a wagon wheel. A halberd pressed against his throat. "Hold!" Krieger ordered. The captive was young, dirt-streaked, eyes wide with animal fear. His lips trembled. "Why?" Krieger demanded. The bandit swallowed. "We're hungry." "So are they," Krieger snapped, gesturing toward the peasants. "Why attack armed soldiers?" The man's gaze flicked to the trees. "You shouldn't be on this road," he whispered. "Why?" "The beasts are moving." Silence fell heavier than the rain. "What beasts?" Adalbert demanded sharply. The bandit laughed a brittle, hysterical sound. "Horned ones, big as oxen. We saw them gathering by the old stones. Whole herds. They're coming south." Krieger studied him. There was no fanatic gleam in the man's eyes, no sign of corruption, just terror. "Where?" Krieger pressed. "Deep, where the forest goes black. We heard the brehorns at night." A halberdier shifted uneasily. Krieger held the bandit's gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "Cut him loose." The halberdier blinked. "Sir?" "Cut him loose." The blade lifted. The bandit scrambled backward, then ran, vanishing into the trees as if swallowed whole. Adalbert sputtered. "You release a criminal? An attacker upon imperial property?" Krieger wiped his blade clean on a fallen cloak. "He'll warn the others to stay clear, and if he lies, then we'll kill whatever's in the trees." Night settled fully now. The rain resumed in earnest. The dead were dragged aside. The wounded were bound with strips of torn cloth. One of the halberdiers died before the bandage could be tied. Krieger stood at the edge of the camp, staring into the black between the trunks. The Reeve's words echoed in his mind. "Accidents happen." Behind him, Adalbert clutched his ledgers protectively. muttering calculations, even as blood seeped into the mud at his feet. The road ahead disappeared into darkness. "Break camp at first light," Krieger said quietly. One of his sergeants hesitated. "Sir, if what that man said is true, the tithe moves," Krieger cut in. "He did not turn from the trees. Dawn would come. The wagons would roll. The Emperor's coin would reach Altdorf or be buried beneath the Drakwald. Either way, the road would be paid in blood, and they would press deeper into the forest regardless." Chapter 2. The Butchered Hamlet. They smelled it before they saw it. Not the sweet rot of autumn leaves, nor the damp musk of the Drakwald after rain, but copper and offal and the heavy, cloying stink of opened bodies left too long in wet air. Krieger raised a fist, and the convoy ground to a halt. Ahead, beyond a sagging split-rail fence, lay the hamlet of Colbrook, listed neat and precise in Brother Adalbert's ledger as owing 6 sacks of rye, 2 pigs, and 12 silver crowns in arrears. No smoke rose from its chimneys. The cottages crouched beneath the trees like beaten dogs. Doors hung open. One roof had caved inward as if something vast had climbed upon it. The only movement came from crows. They lifted in a black flurry as the first wagon creaked forward again, their wings beating the damp air with frantic percussion. The first body hung from an oak at the edge of the clearing. It had once been a man. Now it was a display. His wrists were nailed to the trunk with crude iron spikes driven straight through bone. His belly had been split from sternum to groin. The viscera had been pulled free and draped around his neck like obscene garlands. Rainwater had diluted the blood into dark streaks down his legs, but the cavity still gleamed wetly inside. One of the halberdiers retched into the mud. There were more. 3 women strung up along the path, their throats torn out in ragged crescents. A boy nailed upside down from a branch, his skull split so violently that pale matter had spilled and congealed along the bark. The bodies turned slightly in the breeze, creaking. Hoofprints churned the mud everywhere deep, cloven impressions larger than a man's spread hand. They overlapped and crisscrossed in chaotic patterns, gouged deep as though the creatures that made them had weight and fury in equal measure. "Sigmar preserve us," muttered Sergeant Holtz. Brother Adalbert stared, face pale but lips pursed with irritation rather than horror. "We must verify inventory." Krieger did not answer. He walked into the hamlet. The well had been fouled. Someone or something had dumped 2 corpses into it. Their limbs protruded above the waterline, fingers swollen and pale. Flies swarmed thickly, despite the cool air. A barn door hung from one hinge. Krieger nudged it open with the tip of his sword. Inside, the floor was slick. Livestock had been slaughtered where they stood, cattle gutted and left to bloat. A horse with its head nearly severed lay on its side, one eye pecked hollow by birds. The walls had been carved with crude symbols, spirals, jagged horns, twisted glyphs that seemed to writhe when stared at too long. He had seen such markings before along the forest edge. Beastmen. Fresh. The blood had not yet browned fully. The corpses were not yet stiff. "They can't be more than a day ahead," Holtz said, quietly behind him. A thin sound drifted through the air. Not wind. Crying? Krieger turned sharply. It came from beneath one of the cottages, a low, shuddering sob. He moved toward it cautiously, stepping over a body sprawled in the doorway. The dead man's hands were wrapped around a woodcutter's axe. One horned skull lay nearby, split nearly in half. The villager had fought. Krieger crouched and lifted the cottage's warped door. The cellar hatch beneath had been barred from inside. "Open," he called, voice steady. The sobbing paused. He sheathed his sword slowly and knocked again, softer this time. After a long moment, the bar shifted. The hatch creaked open. The smell of earth and urine drifted up. 2 women huddled in the darkness, faces streaked with dirt and tears. Between them clung a child, a girl of perhaps 6 winters. Her eyes were enormous, unfocused. "They're gone," one of the women whispered. "Are they gone?" "For now," Krieger replied. They emerged, blinking into grey light. The girl began to babble immediately. "Big one," she gasped. "Big as the barn. Horns like trees. It picked up Da like a doll, smashed him on the ground," and she broke into hysterical sobbing. Krieger felt something tighten in his chest. "A minotaur," Holtz muttered. Another halberdier called from the far side of the clearing. "Sir." They gathered near the remains of a crude barricade erected from overturned carts and furniture. 5 villagers lay there, butchered but surrounded by the bodies of 3 beastmen. The creatures were hulking things, man-shaped but twisted, goat heads with curling horns, muscles knotted beneath matted fur. Their mouths were full of broken, yellow fangs. One still clutched a jagged blade fashioned from scrap metal. Another had a pitchfork embedded deep in its eye socket, half snapped. "They fought," Holtz said quietly. Krieger knelt beside one of the dead villagers. The man's arm had been torn clean from its socket. Not cut, torn. The shoulder was a ruin of shredded meat and splintered bone. This had not been a quick slaughter. It had been sport. Brother Adalbert appeared at Krieger's side, clutching his ledger protectively against his chest as if the pages might absorb the carnage. "Any salvageable grain?" he asked. Holtz stared at him. "The barns are destroyed," Krieger said flatly. Adalbert sighed sharply. "Then we must mark total loss. The Emperor's tithe cannot be deferred indefinitely. We cannot linger here. Disease will set in." "Disease?" Holtz barked. "Look around you." Adalbert's gaze hardened. "If the convoy stalls, more villages suffer. The coin must reach Altdorf. That is the priority." A crossbowman approached at a run. "Sir, tracks lead north. Lots of them. And there's something else." Krieger rose. They followed the tracks into the tree line just beyond the hamlet. There, nailed to a tree at eye level, hung a crude totem, a human skull split and wired to a bundle of sticks, daubed in blood. Around it hung scraps of cloth villagers' garments twisted into obscene shapes. Below it, the earth had been churned into a ritual circle. More runes carved into bark, fresh. Further in, faint through the trees, a thin column of smoke rose. "Cooking fires," the scout whispered. Krieger's jaw tightened. "Not a raid, a camp, a mustering. They're gathering," Holtz said, emboldened. The girl's words echoed in Krieger's mind. "Big as the barn. A full herd could swallow a convoy whole." Back in the clearing, the survivors clung together in a tight knot. The 2 women stared blankly. The child refused to release Krieger's cloak when he approached. "You can't leave," one woman said hoarsely. "They'll come back." Adalbert stepped forward briskly. "We do not have capacity to transport refugees beyond immediate necessity. Our escort is limited." "They'll die," Holtz said. Adalbert's eyes flashed. "And if the tithe fails? Do you know what happens to a road warden who loses imperial revenue?" Silence fell. Krieger did know. Courts martial were not gentle, nor were gallows. He looked at the bodies swaying gently from the trees, at the claw marks gouged into doors, at the little girl's dirt-smeared face. If they stayed, they would be encircled. If they abandoned the coin, word would reach Altdorf long before excuses did. He walked slowly to the center of the clearing. "Burn it," he ordered. "Holz, Starret, Seer, burn the bodies. Burn the buildings. Deny them carrion and shelter." The men moved grimly, stacking corpses. The smell when flame touched wet flesh was thick and nauseating. Fat popped, skin split, smoke rose heavy and greasy. The survivors wept openly as their homes burned. Krieger stood rigid, face carved from stone. When it was done, only blackened skeletons of timber remained. He gathered his men. "The herd is close," he said quietly. "We are already within their hunting ground. If we linger, they'll encircle us." Holtz's voice was low. "And the villagers?" Krieger did not hesitate. "They march with us." Relief flickered briefly across the soldiers' faces, but Adalbert stepped in sharply. "At what cost to speed? Each mouth slows us. Each delay risks the coin." Krieger turned on him. "Speak carefully." Adalbert swallowed, but held firm. "You swore an oath, Hauptmann. The Emperor's tithe moves?" Krieger finished. He looked at the survivors. They would slow the wagons. They would drain rations. They would make them vulnerable. And yet, he mounted his horse. "We move now," he said. "South?" Holtz asked. "Yes, away from the smoke, away from the mustering herd, toward open road." The wagons creaked into motion. The survivors trudged alongside, hollow-eyed, as the hamlet's embers smoldered behind them. A low sound rolled through the trees. A horn, deep, brutal, resonant. It vibrated in Krieger's chest like distant thunder. The herd knew. He did not look back. The tithe must move, even if the forest itself rose to claim it, even if heads his included would roll should it fail. The Drakwald closed around them once more, thick and waiting. Chapter 3. Teeth in the trees. The Drakwald did not sleep. It watched. The convoy moved beneath its canopy, like an insect crawling across the palm of something vast and patient. Branches meshed overhead so thick that daylight never truly returned. Instead, there was only a grey half-light that bled into an early dusk. The burned smell of coalbrook clung to the wagons, mixing with sweat, wet leather, and the iron tang of dried blood. They were being followed. Krieger felt it the way a veteran feels the weight of a drawn bow before the string sings. The forest had grown louder in its quiet twigs, snapping just out of sight, the flutter of crows keeping pace, the occasional low rustle that did not belong to wind. The first brayhorn sounded just after sunset. It came from deep in the trees, a long guttural blast that rose and fell like a beast choking on its own rage. It rolled through the undergrowth and echoed between the trunks until it seemed to surround them entirely. The horses screamed. One reared violently, snapping its traces. The wagon lurched as a wheel slipped into a rut. A halberdier barely avoided being crushed beneath the axle as the animal thrashed, eyes rolling white. "Steady!" Holtz roared. Another brayhorn answered. Closer. Then another. The sound crawled beneath skin and into bone. "Circle up!" Krieger ordered. The wagons groaned into defensive position, wheels biting into mud. Crossbows were cranked, halberds lowered. The peasants huddled between axles, clutching one another. Silence followed. Too much silence. Then something small and fast burst from the brush. An Angor, man-sized but twisted, goat legs pumping, matted fur slick with rain. Its face was a mockery of humanity, eyes bright with lunatic hunger. It hurled a crude javelin. The spear punched into a crossbowman's thigh, driving through muscle with a wet crunch. The man screamed, dropping his weapon. Before he hit the ground, 2 more ungers erupted from the trees. They moved like feral dogs, darting, snapping. One leapt onto the fallen crossbowman and sank jagged teeth into his face. The sound was obscene, a wet tearing as lips and cheek ripped free. The man's scream became a gargled shriek as blood flooded his mouth. A halberd descended, cleaving through the Ungor's spine. Bone split. The creature spasmed, twitching like a slaughtered pig. The second Ungor darted in low and slashed at a horse's belly with a hooked blade. The animal convulsed as its abdomen opened in a hot spill of steaming entrails. It collapsed onto its knees, shrieking, intestines slapping against the mud. Krieger was already there. He drove his sword straight through the Ungor's skull, the tip bursting from the back of its horned head in a spray of dark matter. He kicked the corpse free and hauled the wounded crossbowman back by his collar. More shapes moved in the trees, but they did not commit. Stones flew instead. Crude arrows hissed from darkness, punching into wagon planks, rattling against armor. They were testing, probing. When the brayhorn sounded again, it was retreating. The Ungors melted back into the forest. They left 3 men dead and a horse disemboweled. And they took nothing. The second night was worse. Supplies vanished. A grain sack slit open. Contents trampled into mud. A water barrel punctured. Harness straps cut clean through while the sentries swore they had seen nothing. Just before dawn, a scream tore through camp. One of the peasants had wandered too close to the tree line to relieve himself. They found him hanging from a branch not 20 paces from the wagons. His legs had been severed at the knees. The stumps were ragged, chewed. He had bled out slowly, tied upright so he could watch the forest while life drained from him. Pinned to his chest with a splintered spike was a crude carving of a horned skull. A warning. Holtz spat into the mud. "They're herding us." Krieger said nothing. By midday, the Reeve returned. He and his riders emerged from a stand of alder trees as if conjured by malice. Their armor was clean despite the mud. Their horses uninjured. "Terrible business," the Reeve called, feigning sympathy as his gaze swept the battered convoy. "We heard the brayhorns." Krieger did not dismount. "Then you know what hunts us." The Reeve nodded gravely. "Which is why my lord renews his offer. Protection. His militia stands ready." "Where were they at Colebrook?" Holtz demanded. The Reeve's smile flickered. "Spread thin. The forest is large. You withheld them," Krieger said quietly. The Reeve's eyes hardened. "My lord cannot defend every peasant hovel, but he can defend his purse," Krieger replied. Rain began again, thin and cold. "The herd grows bold," the Reeve said. "They sense weakness. Perhaps coin could persuade them elsewhere." Krieger's hand tightened on his reins. "You're suggesting your lord trades with beastmen." "I suggest," the Reeve said smoothly, "that survival requires pragmatism." The implication hung heavy. Krieger leaned forward in the saddle. "Tell your baron that if I discover coin has bought him safety at the Empire's expense, I will drag him to Altdorf in chains myself." The Reeve's jaw twitched. "Careful, Hauptmann. Get off my road." The riders withdrew again, vanishing into green shadow. Holtz exhaled slowly. "They're feeding us to the beasts." "Yes," Krieger said. "The ambush came at the Narrows." The road dipped between 2 rocky rises where ancient roots knotted the ground like coiled serpents. The wagon slowed as wheels fought for purchase. The first boulder crashed down from above, without warning. It smashed into the lead wagon's side, splintering wood and crushing a halberdier beneath it. His scream cut short as ribs shattered inward. Then the forest erupted. Beastmen poured from both slopes in a tidal wave of fur and iron. Brehons screamed, drums pounded, the ground shook beneath their charge. They were not skirmishers now, they were a warband. Ungor arrows fell in a black cloud. One punched through a peasant woman's throat, pinning her to the wagon side. She clawed uselessly at the shaft, eyes bulging as blood poured down her chest. Gauze crashed into the halberd line with the force of a landslide. Axes rose and fell. One halberdier had his arm hacked clean off at the shoulder. The limb spun into mud while he stared at the arterial spray erupting from his torso. Krieger bellowed orders, but the sound drowned beneath the roar. A Gor seized a soldier by the helmet and smashed his face repeatedly into a wagon wheel until teeth and bone turned to pulp. Another hooked a halberd shaft and yanked its wielder forward, biting deep into his neck and tearing out a mouthful of flesh. Blood turned the mud slick as oil. Krieger carved through the first wave, blade rising and falling in practiced arcs. He split skulls, opened bellies, severed tendons so beastmen fell screaming beneath boot and blade. Then the crowd parted. A larger shape strode forward. A bestigor. It towered above the others, clad in scavenged mail and iron plates hammered into grotesque semblance of armor. Its horns curled thick and scarred. One eye was clouded white. In its massive hands it carried a two-handed axe, notched and blackened with old gore. It pointed the weapon at Krieger. A challenge. Krieger stepped forward, breath ragged. The bestigor charged. Its axe fell like a falling tree. Krieger dove aside as the blade smashed into earth, sending mud and stone spraying. He slashed at the creature's flank, but the mail turned the blow. The bestigor backhanded him with its free arm. The impact lifted him off his feet. He hit the ground hard, breath exploding from his lungs. The beast was on him instantly. The axe rose again. Krieger rolled, the blade biting into the ground where his skull had been. He slashed upward blindly, feeling steel bite into furred thigh. Dark blood sprayed hot across his face. The bestigor roared, a sound that shook leaves from branches. It kicked him in the ribs. Something cracked, pain flared white. Krieger forced himself up as the creature wrenched its axe free. They circled in mud, churned red. The bestigor lunged. Krieger stepped inside the swing and drove his sword straight into the creature's abdomen beneath the rib plate. The resistance was immense, muscle like twisted rope, but he pushed, snarling, until the blade punched through the back in a burst of blood. The bestigor screamed, not pain, rage. It dropped the axe and seized Krieger with both hands, lifting him bodily. Its breath was carrion rot. It squeezed. Armor buckled. Air fled his lungs. His vision darkened. With the last of his strength, Krieger released the sword and drew his dagger. He plunged it upward beneath the creature's jaw, driving the blade into the soft palate and up into its skull. The bestigor convulsed. Its grip loosened. They crashed to the ground together. Krieger scrambled free as the beast thrashed, choking on its own blood. He wrenched his sword from its belly and hacked once, twice, 3 times into its neck until the spine parted and the head lolled at an unnatural angle. The surrounding gores faltered. Holtz rallied what remained of the line. Crossbows fired at near point-blank range. Bolts punched into chests and throats. Halberds stabbed and withdrew in wet rhythm. Slowly, brutally, the herd began to break. Not routed, but pulling back, dragging their wounded, claiming their dead. When the last horn call echoed retreat, the road was a charnel pit. Half the soldiers lay still. One wagon's axle was shattered, another's side torn open, grain spilling into blood-soaked mud. Krieger stood swaying amid corpses. Holtz approached, face pale beneath gore. "Sir, look!" One of the slain beastmen lay near the broken wagon. Around its thick neck hung a leather cord. From it dangled a crude wooden token. Holtz lifted it carefully. Carved into the wood, rough but unmistakable, was the stag crest of Baron von Ryssen. Silence fell heavy. Krieger stared at it, jaw tightening. Coin traded for peace, or worse. Behind them, in the forest depths, another brayhorn sounded. Longer, deeper, answered by many more. Krieger turned slowly toward the trees. "They're not done," he said. The herd was gathering, and this time they would not be content with blood. They wanted the wagons. Chapter 4. The Emperor's Coin. The watchtower rose from the edge of the Drakwald like a broken tooth. Its upper half had collapsed long ago, stones scattered down the slope and swallowed by weeds. What remained was a squat cylinder of cracked masonry overlooking the road as it curved toward open farmland beyond the forest's last choking trees. Moss crawled over its flanks. Arrow slits gaped like blind eyes. It was the last defensible ground before the road spilled out of the trees and into the rolling fields that led south toward Altdorf. Krieger reined in at its base and looked back into the forest. The trees stood thick and wet and waiting. The air felt heavy, swollen with anticipation. Behind him, what remained of the convoy limped into the clearing. One wagon rolled crookedly, its axle bound with rope and desperation. The other creaked, but held. Grain sacks were split and patched. Blood had dried in black scales across the boards. Half his men were gone. Holtz still stood. 3 halberdiers, 2 crossbowmen with fewer bolts than fingers, a handful of peasants hollow-eyed and stumbling, and Brother Adalbert, cradling his ledgers like wounded children. Another brayhorn sounded far back among the trees. Then another, closer than before. "They're massing," Holtz said quietly. Krieger dismounted. He walked around the wagon slowly, studying the clearing. The tower's door hung askew but intact. The lower chamber could hold perhaps 30 souls if packed tight. The fallen stones could be dragged to form a crude barricade across the approach. Beyond the tower, the open road shimmered faintly beneath clouded light. If they abandoned the wagons now, they could flee south, faster without the weight. If they burned the coin, scattered the silver into mud and fire, the herd would lose its prize. Perhaps they would turn back into the forest. If he abandoned the peasants, lightened the burden further, his jaw tightened. Adalbert approached, robe stained and torn. "Hauptmann," he said, voice thin but urgent, "we cannot risk total loss. If the coin falls—" "If the coin falls," Krieger said flatly, "it will not matter what excuse you write in that book." Another brayhorn, nearer. The forest trembled with distant movement. Holtz stepped close. "Sir?" Krieger looked at the watchtower again. "We fortify," he said. Relief and dread mingled in Holtz's eyes. "Move," Krieger barked. They worked like condemned men racing a noose. Stones were dragged into a crescent wall across the clearing's mouth. The broken wagon was angled to plug the narrowest approach. Barrels rolled into gaps. Corpses from earlier skirmishes were hauled aside, though one halberdier suggested leaving them as obstacles. Inside the tower, the peasants huddled. One woman clutched the terrified child from Colebrook, rocking her gently while whispering prayers to Sigmar. Adalbert knelt amid damp parchment, trying desperately to salvage ink-smeared figures. Tears cut clean lines down his dirt-streaked face. The first wave came at twilight. They announced themselves with a wall of sound, brayhorns, drums, guttural roars. Then they emerged, Not skirmishers, a war bent. Dozens of gors poured from the tree line. Horns silhouetted against the dying light. Ungos darted between them, loosing arrows in high arcs. Stones whistled overhead. Behind them strode something larger, the Minotaur. It towered above the herd, a mountain of muscle and matted fur. Its horns curved like scythes. Its chest was a slab of scarred flesh crisscrossed with ritual cuts. In its hands it carried a great axe, fashioned from a ship's anchor blade bound to a haft thicker than a man's thigh. It lowered its head and bellowed. The sound shook dust from the tower walls. "Hold!" Cregar roared. Arrows fell first. One punched through a crossbowman's eye, bursting from the back of his skull in a spray of red and grey. He dropped without a sound. The gores crashed into the stone barricade. Moments later, impact rattled teeth. Halberds stabbed downward. Blades sank into fur and flesh. Beastmen screamed and tore back, dragging soldiers forward over the wall. One gore vaulted the stones and landed atop a halberdier, jaws snapping. It bit through the man's cheek and tore half his face away in a single savage wrench. The halberdier's scream became a bubbling hiss as blood poured down his throat. Holtz rammed his halberd through the gore's spine and shoved it off. The Minotaur hit the broken wagon. The impact shattered wood like kindling. The wagon flipped, spilling grain and coin in a glittering cascade across mud. Silver crowns flashed in dying light before vanishing beneath trampling hooves. The Minotaur swung its axe. The blade cleaved a halberdier from shoulder to hip. The body came apart in two wet halves that fell steaming into the churned earth. Inside the tower, peasants screamed. Adalbert clutched a coin chest to his chest, sobbing openly. Two mounted figures burst from the trees behind the herd, the Reeve and 3 of the Baron's men. They rode hard toward the rear wagon. "Sir!" Holtz shouted. Cregar saw it instantly. The Reeve dismounted, shouting to his men. They hacked open the second wagon's chest and began hauling out sacks of silver. "Take it," the Reeve barked, "before the beasts claim it." Cregar felt something inside him go cold and hard. He cut his way toward them, blade rising and falling in efficient, brutal arcs. A gore lunged. He severed its forearm at the elbow and kicked it backward into the Minotaur's path. The creature disappeared beneath a stomp that burst it like rotten fruit. He reached the Reeve just as the man lifted a sack. "Our arrangement stands," the Reeve shouted over the din. "The herd takes some, my lord takes some, and you live to report a raid." Cregar said nothing. He drove his sword straight through the Reeve's mouth. Steel punched through teeth, tongue, and the back of the skull in a spray of bone and blood. The Reeve's eyes went wide in stunned disbelief before dimming. Cregar kicked him free and turned on the Baron's men. One tried to flee. Cregar hamstrung him with a savage cut that sliced through tendon. The man collapsed, screaming, clawing at the mud as Cregar finished him with a thrust through the spine. The last dropped his sack and ran into the forest. He did not get far. An Ungor arrow took him through the neck. The Minotaur roared again. It charged. Cregar met it in the center of the clearing. The beast swung its axe in a horizontal arc. Cregar ducked beneath it, feeling the wind of its passage tug at his hair. The blade struck stone and showered sparks. He slashed at the creature's thigh. The cut opened fur and skin, but barely slowed it. The Minotaur backhanded him with such force that he flew backward into the shattered wagon. Splinters bit into his back. Breath fled his lungs in a painful gasp. The beast advanced, each step sinking deep into blood-soaked mud. Cregar forced himself upright as the Minotaur climbed atop the burning wagon. Flames licked up spilled grain and splintered wood, casting both of them in a hellish glow. The axe rose high. Krigar charged. He leapt onto the wagon's wreckage as the blade descended. It struck where he had been a heartbeat before, cleaving through boards and showering embers. Krigar drove his sword into the Minotaur's abdomen with both hands. The blade sank deep, but the beast did not fall. It grabbed him. One massive hand closed around his torso. Ribs groaned beneath the pressure. The Minotaur lifted him effortlessly and slammed him down against the wagon's iron rim. Pain exploded through his spine. It raised him again to dash him against the flames. With a snarl, Krigar wrenched his dagger free and plunged it into the Minotaur's eye. The blade sunk to the hilt. The beast howled a deafening animal scream. It released him, clawing at its face. Krigar did not hesitate. He seized his fallen sword and drove it upward beneath the creature's ribcage, angling for the heart. Once, twice, 3 times. Each thrust punched deeper, hot blood cascading over his arms. The Minotaur staggered. It swung blindly, grazing his shoulder and tearing armor like parchment. Pain flared, but he held on. With a final, desperate roar, Krigar ripped the blade free and hacked into the creature's neck. The cut bit deep. He struck again and again, until bone parted and the massive head sagged sideways. The Minotaur toppled from the wagon in a thunderous crash that shook the clearing. For a moment, there was only the crackle of flame and ragged breathing. Then, from the tree line, a long, wavering horn note, retreat. The herd began to withdraw. Gors dragged their wounded. Ungors vanished into shadow. The Brehorns faded slowly into the depths of the Drakwald. Dawn crept pale and cold across the clearing. Smoke hung low. The watchtower stood blackened but upright. Of the soldiers, 4 remained standing. Of the peasants, fewer still. 1 wagon was destroyed entirely. The other, miraculously, remained intact, though its chest was half empty, coins scattered and trampled beyond recovery. Adalbert sat amid the mud and ash, weeping over soaked, illegible ledgers. Krigar stood over the Minotaur's corpse, blood drying stiff across his armor. Holtz approached slowly. "It's over." Krigar looked toward the forest. "No," he said quietly. "It never is." They gathered what coin remained. 1 chest, half filled. They left the rest buried in churned earth and blood. When the battered convoy finally rolled southward onto open road, the forest did not pursue. Behind them lay a field of ash and bodies. Ahead lay Altdorf. Krigar rode at the front, ribs bound tight, shoulder bleeding slowly through bandage. He would report the herd destroyed. He would report Baron von Reisen's treachery. He would report villages lost, the Emperor's coin reduced. Whether he would be praised for saving it or hanged for failing to protect it entirely remained to be seen. As the Drakwald receded behind him, Krigar did not feel victory, only the slow, gnawing certainty that the Empire rotted not just from horn and claw, but from within.